Katie was just fun-loving girl, loved life, very talented in what she did. Loved her friends, full of development, carry on. Just, yeah, full of life.
And show jumping was something that was very important.
Very talented, and loved doing it. So she did.
James.
On the 3rd of August 2020, a young woman was being driven toward a hospital in Northern Ireland. She was unconscious. The man behind the wheel told paramedics and later police that she had tried to take her own life. He also offered an explanation for some of her bruising, a recent fall from a horse. Nobody at that stage had time to test either claim. A woman needed emergency care. The explanation that arrived with her became almost by default the starting point for everything that followed. Katie Simpson never regained consciousness. She died 7 days later. She was 21 years old. Months afterward, the man who had supplied that first explanation was arrested. Jonathan Creswell was eventually charged with Katie's rape and murder. Prosecutors would allege that he attacked her and then staged the scene to resemble a suicide attempt. Creswell denied both charges. His trial opened at Derry Crown Court in April 2024. The next morning, he was found dead. The jury was discharged. No verdict was ever delivered. The criminal case ended without a legal determination of what happened inside that house. But too later, independent investigations did establish something else. The Police Ombudsman for Northern Ireland examined how officers had handled the case in 2020. An independent review, published years afterward, examined the years that came before it. Both concluded that the system built to protect Katie Simpson had failed her long before, and in the hours immediately after, she was found unconscious. This is not simply the story of a murder trial that never reached its end. It is the story of how one account, supplied by one man, shaped almost everything that was collected, searched, questioned, and believed, and of what may have been lost while that account went largely unchallenged. Katie Simpson grew up close to Tynan in County Armagh. She attended the Royal School Armagh. From an early age, her horses were at the centre of her world. People who knew her described someone funny, fearless, and hard-working, a young woman who threw herself into show jumping with real commitment, both to the sport and to the animals she cared for. That world gave her competition, friendship, employment, and the outline of a future. It also brought Jonathan Creswell into her life. Creswell worked at a local equestrian yard. He was, at the time, in a relationship with Katie's older sister, Christina. To Katie, he was not a stranger arriving from outside her world. He was already inside it, connected to her family, to the yard where she worked, to the community she hoped to build a career within. According to the independent review published in 2026, Creswell's influence over Katie began when she was still a child, said to be around the age of 10. The review concluded that what followed was a pattern of grooming that deepened over the following decade, escalating control over her schooling, her finances, her communications, her movements, and eventually her body. It is worth pausing on where this finding comes from. It is not the product of a completed criminal trial, because Creswell was never tried for offences against Katie herself while alive to answer them. It is the conclusion of an independent statutory review led by Dr. Jan Melia, commissioned specifically to examine what had gone wrong across policing, health, safeguarding, and the sporting world around Katie's life and death. Its findings carry institutional weight. They do not carry the weight of a jury's verdict because no jury ever heard this part of the case. What the review did establish, drawing on medical, safeguarding, and intelligence records built up over years, is a repeating shape. From around 2014 onward, Katie made a series of visits to accident and emergency departments. Head injuries, facial injuries, fractures. Each one was attributed at the time to horses, a fall, a kick, an accident of the kind that genuinely does happen around stables. In 2017, she suffered a serious spinal fracture and was fitted with a back brace. Just over 5 weeks later, she presented again with another facial injury. No safeguarding referral was made. Individually, any one of these incidents might be unremarkable. Equestrian sport carries real physical risk, and injuries from horses are not inherently suspicious. But the review's concern was the pattern across years repeated escalating, and never once connected into a single picture by any of the professionals who saw Katie, one appointment at a time. Each visit to accident and emergency was, in effect, treated as its own isolated event. A doctor examining a fracture is not usually shown the record of a head injury from 3 years earlier, or told that the same explanation, a fall, a kick, an accident with the same animal in the same yard, has been offered again and again. Safeguarding systems depend on someone joining those dots. According to the review, nobody did. The equestrian world Katie belonged to compounded the problem in its own way. It was a small, close community built on informal trust rather than institutional oversight. Trainers held enormous influence over young riders' access to horses, competitions, and future opportunities. A young woman who raised concerns about a senior figure in that world risked more than an awkward conversation. She risked her standing, her livelihood, and her access to the animal she had built her identity around. The review would later note that Creswell was not the only adult in that world whose conduct toward young women and girls drew concern. More than 37 people are reported to have come forward with allegations concerning him since his death, a figure the review treats as evidence of a pattern extending well beyond Katie herself. By the time she was in her late teens, according to the review, Creswell exercised significant control over Katie's day-to-day life. She was living with him and her sister at a property in Gortnassy Meadows near Lettershandoney outside Derry. The review describes her being taken out of her GCSE studies, her phone and movements monitored, her wages and finances controlled. Multiple pieces of intelligence about coercive and controlling behavior reached police over this period. Separately, and years earlier in 2010, Creswell had been convicted of multiple assaults against a former partner, assaults that included non-fatal strangulation and threats to kill. That conviction sat on police systems for a decade before August 2020. It was information available to any officer who wished to look for it. It did not, in the moment that mattered most, change how his account was received. On the 3rd of August 2020, Katie was found unconscious at the property in Gortnassy Meadows. Creswell's account, given first to paramedics and then to police, was that she had attempted to hang herself from a banister. He drove her, in her own car, partway toward Altnagelvin Hospital before an ambulance took over. He repeated to officers what he had told paramedics, a suicide attempt, and separately a recent fall from a horse that might explain some of her other injuries. Two things happened almost simultaneously. Katie was rushed into emergency care, and a version of events built entirely from one man's account became the working assumption for the police response that followed. This is where the case begins to turn from tragedy into something the Police Ombudsman would later describe in stark terms as a flawed investigation. Consider what a suspicious death scene ordinarily requires: a cordon, a methodical search, photography of injuries, preservation of clothing, forensic examination of vehicles, immediate securing of phones and other devices, all of it carried out on the assumption that a crime might have occurred until the evidence says otherwise. That is not, by the Ombudsman's own findings, what happened at Gortnassy Meadows. The property was not effectively searched. What documentation exists shows only a brief walkthrough captured on body-worn video, the alleged ligature point visible for a matter of seconds, not properly examined. There was no early supervising officer directing the response as a potential crime scene. Katie's car was seized, but not subjected to a full forensic examination at the time. Electronic devices inside the property were not immediately secured, and Katie's phone, her primary phone, could not be found at all. Meanwhile, neighbouring CCTV captured movements at the property that would only take on significance later: Creswell leaving and returning, changing his clothing, and a woman removing a large bag to another vehicle. There was also a gap between the ambulance leaving with Katie and Creswell's own arrival at the hospital. He travelled separately, in a different vehicle, arriving some time after her. None of it at the time triggered the kind of scrutiny a homicide inquiry would apply as a matter of routine. Katie remained in hospital, unconscious, for a week. Medical staff who examined her noted extensive bruising, and some raised concerns about what they were seeing, but police did not comprehensively photograph her injuries for evidential purposes during that critical week, while she was alive, and those injuries were fresh. She died on the 10th of August 2020 without regaining consciousness. At that point, police were treating her death as a suicide. Concerns existed from nurses, from members of the public, from some officers within the force itself, and from information already on file describing a young woman who did not, by every account of those who knew her, seem like someone who would take her own life. Creswell's 2010 conviction for violence sat unconnected in the background. None of these threads had yet been drawn together. This is, in many ways, the central mechanism the Police Ombudsman's report identifies. Not a single catastrophic decision, but a cumulative one. A death treated from the outset as self-inflicted is investigated differently from a death treated as potentially suspicious. Resources are allocated differently, forensic thresholds are lower, witnesses are approached with different questions or not approached at all. Once officers accepted the suicide account, nearly every subsequent decision, what to search, what to seize, what to preserve, whom to interview, was shaped by that acceptance. The car did not need full forensic examination because homicide was not, in the moment, the working theory. The scene did not need to be preserved with the same rigor because officers did not believe another person had caused Katie's injuries there. The investigation, in other words, had already reached a conclusion. Everything that followed was asked to fit around it. For months the case moved slowly and at times uncertainly between different parts of the police structure, local policing teams, criminal investigation officers, and eventually a major investigation team. The Ombudsman later identified problems with supervision, with the ownership of the inquiry, and with how intelligence about Katie and Creswell's relationship was handled internally. But the case was not static. Public concern persisted. A former detective, James Brannigan, was among those who continued to press for the death to be looked at differently. Family members, Katie's mother, Noeline Mullen, and others pushed back against the narrative they had been given, describing a daughter who did not match the picture being drawn of her. In January 2021, the case transferred more fully to the major investigation team. The same fragments of information, the medical pattern, the 2010 conviction, the coercive control intelligence, the CCTV, the missing phone were, for the first time, considered together rather than as isolated details. That shift in approach mattered as much as any single new fact. An investigation built around one working theory tends to interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that support it. An investigation genuinely testing two competing explanations, self-harm, or an assault disguised as self-harm, asks different questions of the same material. Witnesses who had described Creswell's controlling behavior were approached again, this time by officers actively looking for a pattern rather than noting isolated complaints. Katie's relationships, her finances, and her communications in the months before her death were examined with a different level of scrutiny than they had received in August 2020. The question changed. It was no longer simply whether Katie's death was consistent with suicide, it was whether the suicide account had been constructed to prevent anyone from asking whether it was something else. One discovery gave that question physical weight. Katie's main phone, absent since the earliest hours of the investigation, was located only after Creswell's arrest in March 2021 during a criminal interview. It had been hidden in a field. The device itself has not been shown in anything publicly available to contain some single decisive piece of evidence. Its significance lies elsewhere. Until its discovery, the absence of the phone could plausibly be explained by confusion, poor procedure, and oversight in a chaotic first response. A phone deliberately hidden in a field does not fit that explanation. It suggests, at minimum, that someone did not want it found. Creswell was arrested in March 2021 on suspicion of murder. He was later charged with rape and murder and remained on bail under a public protection risk management framework whose assessed risk category fluctuated over the following years as the case moved slowly toward trial. During this period, attention also turned to what had happened in the immediate aftermath of Katie being found. 3 women, Hayley Robb, Jill Robinson, and Rose de Montmorency Wright, were later prosecuted in connection with actions taken after Katie's injuries occurred, clothing washed, blood cleaned, information withheld from investigators. Their guilty pleas, entered ahead of sentencing in June 2024, rested on an agreed basis that matters to state precisely. The court did not establish that these women knew Creswell had killed Katie. Their pleas proceeded on the understanding that they believed at the time that Katie had been assaulted while still operating to varying degrees within the suicide account Creswell had given. What the court did establish is that evidence and information connected to that assault were concealed or interfered with in the hours and days that followed. The convictions did not prove murder. They established that the immediate aftermath of Katie's injuries had not been transparent, and that opportunities to preserve the truth had been actively narrowed by people other than Creswell himself. Sentencing remarks in that case, delivered at Derry Crown Court, described in some detail what each woman was said to have done: clothing removed and laundered, evidence of blood addressed in the property, information about the true circumstances kept from the officers investigating what all three, on their own account, still believed at the time to be a serious assault rather than a killing. The court accepted that basis. Each received a suspended sentence rather than immediate custody, an outcome that reflected the specific, limited basis on which their pleas had been entered, not an assessment of what they might have known about Katie's death itself. For Katie's family, the case moved forward on two fronts at once, seeking accountability for the killing itself and pressing separately for acknowledgement of how the response to it had been handled. Her mother, Noeline Mullen, would later describe, in the independent reviews published forward, small details she had noticed and raised at the time marks that did not sit easily with the explanation she was given, and a persistent sense that neither she nor her daughter had been treated by the systems meant to protect them with the seriousness the situation demanded. Against this backdrop, the case against Creswell built toward trial. Prosecutors alleged that he had attacked Katie and then arranged the scene to resemble a suicide attempt, using her documented history of horse-related injuries and the ligature staging to make the account plausible to first responders. He denied the charges of rape and murder in full. The trial opened at Derry Crown Court on the 23rd of April 2024. For Katie's family, it represented the first real opportunity for the competing accounts of her death to be tested in open court, for witnesses to be examined, for evidence to be put to scrutiny, for a jury to weigh the case and reach a verdict either way. That process lasted a single day. The following morning, Jonathan Creswell was found dead at his home. His death was treated as non-suspicious. The jury was discharged, the trial was over. No verdict was ever reached on the charges of rape and murder. The defense case was never presented. The prosecution's evidence was never fully tested by cross-examination. Creswell was never convicted, and he was never acquitted. That distinction matters, and it is worth being precise about it. The allegations prosecutors intended to prove cannot be narrated as though a jury confirmed them. Creswell's death is not an admission of guilt in any legal sense. What remains from the criminal process is an unresolved charge, serious, formally laid, but never tested to a verdict. What did not end with Creswell's death were the institutional inquiries running in parallel. In November 2024, the Police Ombudsman for Northern Ireland published its findings on how the original 2020 investigation had been conducted. Its conclusions were direct. It found a lack of investigative mindset among the officers involved. It found an unwarranted willingness to accept Creswell's account at face value without the level of independent verification a sudden, serious injury of this kind would ordinarily demand. It identified failures across scene management, forensic collection, supervision, and the handling of intelligence that had existed on file for years. 6 officers became subject to disciplinary recommendations as a result. The individual consequences were, in practice, limited management advice in some cases, others having already retired from the service, but the report's significance was not primarily about individual sanction. It formally, officially established that the initial police response to Katie Simpson's death had failed her and her family. In May 2026, the Independent Katie Simpson review, led by Dr. Jan Melia, running to roughly 270 pages, widened that conclusion considerably. Where the Ombudsman's report examined the days surrounding Katie's death, the review examined the years that preceded it. the missed A and E pattern, the unreported coercive control, the safeguarding gaps across health, education and the equestrian world, and the way Creswell's account was treated as inherently credible at multiple points across a decade. The review's language was pointed. It described the case as bearing hallmarks associated with what researchers term concealed or staged homicide, a young, physically fit victim, a death occurring at home, the account originating with the person who found her, a documented history of domestic violence, and a suicide narrative offered before any independent verification had occurred. It used the phrase institutional misogyny to describe patterns identified across the agencies involved. Katie's account, mediated as it was through Creswell in the earliest hours, receiving less weight than his. It is worth being careful about what that phrase does and does not mean. It does not require that any individual officer, nurse, or safeguarding professional consciously set out to protect Creswell or disregard Katie. Institutional failure of this kind rarely depends on any single person's deliberate intent. It can emerge instead from accumulated, largely unexamined assumptions that a calm, articulate account from the person present is inherently more reliable than the absence of one from the person who cannot speak. That recurring injuries explained individually, appointment by appointment, don't require anyone to ask about the pattern. That domestic control is a private relationship matter until it very obviously is not. The review made more than 16 formal recommendations spanning police training, safeguarding referral thresholds, coercive control awareness, and oversight of public protection bail arrangements. It called for closer coordination between health services and police when a pattern of injury recurs across years rather than isolated incidents, and for clearer thresholds at which a controlling relationship, rather than a single violent episode, should trigger intervention. It examined, too, how Creswell had been managed on bail between his arrest in 2021 and the collapse of his trial in 2024, including fluctuations in the risk category assigned to him under public protection arrangements, despite further disclosures reaching the authorities during that period. The Police Service of Northern Ireland issued a formal apology following the review's publication, acknowledging that the force had failed Katie and her family, and stating that changes had since been made to how suspicious deaths are investigated, how coercive control is recognized, and how supervision is exercised in the earliest hours of a case. Recommendations and apologies, whatever their sincerity, cannot undo what was not done in August 2020. They cannot return officers to Gortnassy Meadows to search it as a preserved crime scene. They cannot forensically examine Katie's car in its original condition. They cannot recover a phone at the moment it first mattered, rather than 8 months later, hidden in a field. They cannot photograph injuries that went undocumented during the 1 week when documenting them was still possible, and they cannot reconvene the trial that ended after a single day. What remains open is a coronial inquest led by Coroner Joe McCriskin, which has been working through hundreds of police files, reportedly running to tens of thousands of pages alongside the Ombudsman's material and available pathology evidence. An inquest is not a criminal trial. It cannot convict anyone, and it cannot deliver the kind of verdict a jury might once have reached on the charges Creswell faced. What it may be able to do is establish, with more clarity than has so far been possible, the medical circumstances of Katie's death and identify whatever remains unaddressed by the reviews already published. Several things about this case remain genuinely unresolved, and a documentary account owes its audience honesty about that. The precise sequence of events inside the property on the 3rd of August 2020 has never been established by a court. The full contents of the confidential post-mortem findings have not been made public in detail. The complete picture of what digital evidence existed and what may have been lost in the gap before Katie's phone was found is not fully known. Whether every one of the more than 37 people who have alleged mistreatment by Creswell has had the opportunity to pursue a formal complaint is also not publicly established. And because no jury ever returned a verdict, the central criminal allegation against Jonathan Creswell that he raped and murdered Katie Simpson remains, in the strict legal sense, unproven. This is an uncomfortable place for a documentary to sit. It would be simpler, in narrative terms, to state plainly what most of the evidence gathered by investigators appears to point toward. But simplicity of that kind is exactly what this case warns against. A single, confident account offered before the surrounding facts were tested is what allowed the original investigation to go as far wrong as two separate official inquiries later found it did. Repeating that pattern in the opposite direction would not honor Katie Simpson. It would only replace one unverified certainty with another. What is proven through two separate and independently conducted institutional processes is this: the investigation that followed Katie's death did not meet the standard it should have. The account of the person who brought her to hospital was accepted well before the surrounding circumstances had been properly tested. Evidence that might have challenged that account, a phone, a vehicle, a set of injuries, a decade-old conviction, years of accumulating warning signs, was not pursued with the urgency the situation demanded until persistence from Katie's family, a handful of officers, and outside observers eventually forced the case to be looked at again. At the start of this story, Katie Simpson arrived at hospital with an explanation for her condition already attached to her. By its end, that explanation had itself become the central subject of two separate official inquiries. The most consequential decision in this case may not have been made inside a courtroom at all. It may have been made in the first hours of the 3rd of August 2020, when the account of the one person able to speak was accepted before enough evidence existed to know whether it was true. Officers reopened the case, prosecutors brought charges, a review identified grooming, coercive control, and institutional failure spanning more than a decade. The police force apologized. Procedures have, by its own account, since changed. None of it can fully repair what the first investigation failed to preserve: a cordon that was never properly set, a search that lasted seconds on a body-worn camera rather than hours with a forensic team, a car released back into use before it could be examined, a phone that sat hidden in a field for 8 months while the case built, unknowingly, around its absence. Each of these, on its own, might be called an oversight. Together, considered against a decade of missed warning signs and a man with a known history of violence whose word was, in the moment that mattered, simply taken, they describe something closer to a system that was not designed to ask the right question at the right time. The coronial process now underway may yet add detail. This account cannot offer pathology findings not yet public, a clearer account of the hours before Katie was found, conclusions the criminal trial never reached a chance to test. It cannot deliver a verdict on rape or murder. That question legally closed the moment Jonathan Creswell died. What remains open is something broader than any one man's guilt or innocence. It is the question of how a young woman's own account of her life, her injuries, her fear, her control over her own choices, came to matter so much less than the account offered calmly by the person standing beside her hospital bed. Because once an account determines what evidence is gathered and what is left uncollected, it also determines how much of the truth can ever, later, be recovered. That is the question Katie Simpson's case leaves behind for the inquest still to come, and for everyone who hears her story after it.